She did not cry. That was the thing no one expected. When Alpha King Caspian Drave read the sentence aloud in the great hall, his voice steady and cold as iron pulled from winter ground, when the word banishment fell into the silence like a stone dropped into still water, every eye in the room turned to Sarah Voss and waited for her to break. She did not. She stood in the center of the ceremonial circle, with her hands loose at her sides and her chin lifted just slightly, not in defiance, not in the proud rebellion of the wrongly accused, but in something quieter and far more unsettling. Acceptance. Pure, total, devastating acceptance. The kind that does not fight because it has already made its peace with something the rest of the room does not yet understand. Sarah Voss, Caspian said, and his voice carried the full weight of his title, the full authority of a king who had never once flinched from the duties that power demanded of him. You have been found guilty of treason against the Drave Pack, of stealing classified documents pertaining to the Northern Accord, of conspiring to deliver those documents to our enemies beyond the Grey Reaches. The evidence is clear. The testimony is recorded. You will be stripped of your pack affiliation, your name removed from the rolls of the Drave lineage, and you will be exiled to the border territories before the next moonrise. Do you have anything to say in your defense? The hall was enormous. It held 300 wolves on a full assembly night. And tonight, every seat was filled, every balcony crowded, every doorway thick with bodies pressed together to witness the sentencing of a traitor. Sarah had catalogued the history of this hall in the archives. She knew that the stones in the floor were 300 years old, quarried from the eastern mountains during the reign of Caspian's great-great-grandfather. She knew that the banners overhead represented every significant alliance the Drave line had ever forged. She knew the hall better than most people in it, because she had spent 7 years reading about it, writing about it, preserving its records with the careful hands of someone who understood that history was fragile and deserved to be handled gently. She had loved this hall. She had loved what it represented. She supposed she still did, even now. No, she said. Her voice was clear. It did not shake. I have nothing to say. The murmur that moved through the crowd was not what she had expected. It was not relief or satisfaction. It was discomfort. People shifted in their seats. Someone near the back made a sound that might have been a suppressed protest. Sarah did not look for the source. She kept her eyes forward, not quite meeting the king's gaze but not avoiding it either, fixing her attention somewhere in the middle distance where she could hold herself together without the risk of coming undone if she saw something she could not afford to see in his face. Caspian looked at her for a long moment. She felt the weight of it, even without meeting his eyes directly. He was not a man who showed uncertainty, and she did not expect uncertainty from him now. What she felt from him across the distance of the ceremonial circle was something she could not name, something that pressed against the edges of her awareness like a word in a language she had studied, but never spoken aloud. Then he looked away. He lifted the ceremonial seal from the table beside him, pressed it to the document that Elder Rowe held open, and it was done. Let it be recorded, Elder Rowe said, his ancient voice carrying the dry dust of ceremony. Sarah Voss, formerly of the Drave Pack Archives, is hereby exiled. Let no member of this pack offer her shelter, sustenance, or acknowledgement within pack borders. Let the wolves of the Grey Reaches know that she walks among them as one without a name. She walked out of the hall under her own power. Every step was even. She did not look back. If she had looked back, she might have seen the king still watching the door long after she had passed through it, his expression carved into something that his counsel would later describe, uncertainly, as troubled. If you are enjoying this story, do not forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories like this one. The Grey Reaches were not what the stories made them sound. Every child in the Drave Pack grew up hearing about the border territories as a place of punishment and shadow, a wasteland where the exiled and the forsaken scratched out half-lives in the cold, without the warmth of pack bonds to sustain them. The reality was harder than the stories, and also, in its way, more human. The people who lived in the Reaches had built something in the absence of everything the pack had taken from them. Not comfort, not safety, not the particular warmth of belonging that a pack bond carried in the blood like a second heartbeat, but structure, routine, a kind of stripped down dignity that came from surviving circumstances that were meant to break you. Sarah recognized it because she had read about it in documents that predated the current exile policy by 2 centuries, in the diaries of banished wolves who had eventually found ways to endure. She had preserved those records with the same care she gave to everything in the archives. She wondered, walking the gray-brown road toward the settlement cluster that the exiles called Ashwick, whether anyone had added her name to those records yet. Whether Elder Rowe had dictated the entry himself or delegated it to one of the junior archivists. Whether the junior archivist had spelled her name correctly. She had trained all 3 of them herself. The thought almost broke her composure. Not the exile, not the sentencing, not the stripping of her pack bond, which had felt like a thread pulled from fabric, painful and clean. The thought of someone misspelling her name in the official record was what almost made her stumble on the road because she had cared so much about getting things right, had spent 7 years of her life making sure that every name and date and detail was recorded with precision and respect. And now she was the entry, and she would not be there to check it. She steadied herself. She kept walking. The road curved northeast, and the packlands fell away behind her, and the light changed subtly, becoming something flatter and less gold, the particular gray-silver quality of light in a place that did not quite belong to anyone. The settlement appeared in the early afternoon, a cluster of stone and timber buildings, arranged without particular planning around a central well. A woman with iron-gray hair watched her approach from the doorway of what appeared to be a communal kitchen. Her arms were crossed, and her expression was not welcoming, but it was not hostile either. It was the expression of someone who had seen this particular walk many times and had long since run out of room for surprise. "New exile?" the woman said. "Yes," Sarah said. "Pack?" "Drave." Something shifted in the woman's expression. Not softness exactly, but a fractional opening. "Drave exiles usually come in worse shape than you look. What did they say you did?" Sarah considered the question. "Treason," she said. The woman looked at her for a long moment with the direct, unhurried assessment of someone who had learned to read people quickly, because her survival had depended on it. "Did you do it?" she asked. "No," Sarah said. It was the first time she had said it aloud, and saying it did not feel like the release she might have expected. It felt like setting down something very heavy in a place where there was no one to help her carry it. The woman nodded slowly. "Most of them say that," she said. "But you are the first one in a long time who said it like you are not trying to convince me." She stepped back from the doorway. "Come in. There is food. My name is Dagna. I run this place, which means I make the rules, and everyone pretends to argue about them and then follows them anyway. You can have the room at the end of the east corridor until you figure out something more permanent. You will work for your meals. I do not have charity. I have community, which is different." "I understand," Sarah said, and followed her inside. The days in Ashwick had a texture unlike anything Sarah had known in the 7 years she had spent in the Drave archives. There, time had moved in. The particular rhythm of scholarly work, long quiet hours punctuated by the small satisfactions of a document properly catalogued, a historical mystery resolved, a record saved from deterioration. Here, time was physical. She helped Dagna in the kitchen. She learned to repair the stone walls of the settlement, a skill she had never needed before, filling the gaps that the winter cracked open with a mortar mixture that had to be exactly right, or it would fail by spring. She learned which plants grew at the border of pack territory that could be harvested without triggering the boundary wards, and which ones were left alone for reasons the older exiles explained, with the particular economy of people who had learned hard lessons and were willing to share them. She learned the faces and stories of the 24 people who made up the permanent population of Ashwick, and she stored those details with the same careful attention she had once given to historical records, because she had come to understand that people were records too, and they deserved to have someone paying attention. She did not think about Caspian Drave. She was very deliberate about this. She constructed the absence of him in her mind, the way she had learned to construct the mortar for the walls, with precise ingredients and precise proportions. And she checked the structure regularly for cracks and repaired them as they appeared. She was good at repair. She had always been good at the careful work of maintenance. What she did think about, in the long quiet hours after the settlement went to sleep, and she lay in the narrow bed in the east corridor room with the gray light of the borderlands coming through the single small window, was the document she had been accused of stealing. She thought about it the way you think about a puzzle you cannot quite set aside, turning it over in her mind, examining its edges. She had not stolen it. She knew precisely who had, and she had made the choice. Standing in the great hall with 300 wolves watching her, to say nothing. She had made that choice with her eyes open and her hands steady, and she did not regret it. And she could not explain it to anyone in Ashwick, because they would not understand, because the reasons lived in a place inside her that was not built from logic, but from something older and less reasonable. Something that had to do with loyalty, and what loyalty really meant when it was tested in a way that cost you everything. It was on the 14th night in Ashwick that the wolf appeared. Sarah had gone outside after midnight because the room felt too small and the silence felt too loud. The particular combination that meant her carefully maintained composure was showing stress fractures and needed air to stabilize. She walked to the edge of the settlement where the open ground stretched toward the pack territory boundary, a line marked not by any physical barrier, but by the shift in the air itself, the change in pressure that a wolf without a pack felt in the bones. She had been standing there for perhaps 10 minutes, breathing slowly, when she became aware of eyes on her from the tree line. She turned. She did not run. Running, in her experience, was an instruction to the thing watching you to decide what it wanted to do with you, and she had no interest in giving anything that option tonight. She turned and looked directly at the place where the eyes were, and after a moment, the wolf stepped out of the shadow between the trees and into the open ground, and she stopped breathing. She had never seen a wolf that size. She knew wolf sizes. She had read everything written about wolf forms in the Drave archives, the records of notable shifters, the historical accounts of powerful alphas and their pack animals, the biological documentation that the pack physicians maintained with clinical precision. Nothing in those records had prepared her for the reality of the creature standing 40 feet away in the gray-silver light. It was black, entirely black, without even the pale underbelly that most wolves of this size carried. It stood at the shoulder at a height that suggested a shifter of extraordinary power, the kind of power that was almost mythological in contemporary packs, the kind that showed up in the oldest records as something spoken of with a reverence that bordered on fear. Its eyes were the pale gold that Sarah associated with one specific lineage, one specific bloodline, one specific man. She knew who this was. She had always been very good at knowing things. "You should not be here," she said. Her voice was steady. She was impressed by that, distantly, in the way you could be impressed by something while also being unable to fully feel it, because the part of your brain responsible for feeling things had temporarily gone very quiet in order to concentrate on survival. You are outside your territory, if anyone in the Pack Council knew you had crossed the boundary, there would be consequences. The wolf did not move. It watched her with those pale gold eyes, and the watching had a quality to it that she recognized from the sentencing. That same pressing weight, that same sense of something being assessed with a patience that had no interest in rushing itself. "You are investigating," she said. It was not a question. She had spent 7 years reading the histories of Caspian Drave's reign, and she knew things about him that he might not know were recorded. She knew he was methodical. She knew he had never, in 9 years of ruling, rendered a verdict without personally examining every piece of evidence first. She knew that the speed of her trial had been unusual for him. Driven by political pressure, she understood perfectly, because she had catalogued the records of that pressure too. She knew that it would have bothered him afterward, that something in the nature of the verdict would have snagged on whatever he used for a conscience, and refused to let go. She had known this, actually. She had known it standing in the great hall. She had chosen silence anyway. The wolf took one step toward her. She held her ground. It was not bravery. It was more that her feet had arrived at some independent agreement with the ground that they were not moving, and the rest of her had decided to respect that agreement. "I am not going to tell you anything," she said quietly. "I want you to understand that clearly. Whatever you are looking for, here, you will not find it from me. Not because I am protecting someone I should not be protecting, because I made a choice, and the choice was deliberate, and I am living with it." She paused. The wolf had gone very still. "You should go back. Whatever you think you know, whatever you think you are finding, it will cost more than the finding is worth. Go back, Caspian." The wolf's reaction to its name in her mouth was subtle. A slight change in the set of its shoulders. A fractional increase in the intensity of that pale gold gaze. Then it turned, slowly, and walked back into the shadow of the trees, and Sarah stood at the border of the gray lands alone in the silence, until her legs finally decided they had been still long enough. And she walked back to the settlement and went to bed and lay in the dark and did not sleep. What do you think will happen next? Leave your predictions in the comments below. In the palace, in the private study that only 3 people had ever been allowed to. Enter uninvited. Caspian Drave stood at the window with the fragment of document in his hand, and tried to reconcile 2 things that refused to be reconciled. The fragment had been found by his boundary patrol, clutched in the talons of a messenger hawk that had died somewhere over the eastern ridge, its flight path suggesting it had been dispatched from within pack territory, not from without. The fragment was partial, torn from a larger document, and what remained of the text was enough to confirm something that he had been trying not to confirm for 14 days. The document Sarah had been accused of stealing had not left pack territory. It had never been delivered to an outside party. It had been used internally by someone who had needed it to disappear from the official record, and had arranged for Sarah to take the blame, because Sarah had access, and Sarah was quiet, and Sarah, apparently, could be relied upon to accept the consequences without making noise. He had not understood that part. He still did not entirely understand it. He had gone to the border last night, in wolf form, because he had needed to see her, needed the direct sensory evidence of her presence and state that a wolf could gather in ways that human perception could not. He had found her standing at the boundary line in the dark, like she was waiting for something, and when she had looked at him without fear and told him clearly that she would not help him, he had felt something shift in the deep center of himself with the slow grinding inevitability of tectonic plates. He had told himself, crossing back into pack territory, that the shift was simply the weight of evidence accumulating, the logical response to a wrongful exile becoming undeniable. He was very practiced at telling himself things like that. The fragment pointed to one of 3 people. He had spent the 14 days since the sentencing quietly eliminating possibilities, and he was down to 1. The remaining possibility was politically catastrophic in a way that made the Northern Accord negotiations look like a minor administrative inconvenience. It was also, based on the evidence, almost certainly true. Caspian had spent 9 years making decisions that were politically catastrophic when they needed to be, and he was not going to stop now because this one came with a personal cost attached. He called his head of intelligence before dawn. He laid out what he had found. He watched the man's face go through the same sequence of realizations that his own face had gone through, compressed into a shorter time frame because he had provided the map. Then he said the name of the person he believed responsible, and he watched the intelligence chief's expression arrive at the same reluctant conclusion. "This will be complicated," the intelligence chief said. "Most true things are," Caspian said. "If you move against this person without absolute proof, the political fallout could destabilize the Northern Accord entirely. Then, we will find absolute proof," Caspian said. "We will find it quickly, because I am not leaving her in the gray reaches a day longer than is necessary." The intelligence chief paused. He was a careful man, a man who chose his words with the precision of someone who understood that words, once released, could not be recalled. Her, he said, neutrally. The exile, Caspian said, and his voice had the particular flatness that his advisors had learned to associate with subjects that were not open for discussion. Sarah Voss, who was falsely convicted on my order, in my hall, before my pack. Yes, her. He turned back to the window. The dawn was beginning to arrive over the eastern peaks, thin and cold, the specific light of early autumn mornings that always made the mountains look carved from something more permanent than stone. Find me the proof. You have 7 days. The intelligence chief found it in 5. Sarah did not know any of this. She knew only that the wolf had, appeared again on the 2nd night, and the 3rd, and the 4th, and that each time it came a little closer and stayed a little longer, and that she had stopped telling it to leave because she had used up whatever reserve of willpower was responsible for that particular instruction, and had not yet managed to replenish it. On the 5th night, it lay down at a distance of perhaps 20 feet, curling its enormous body into the grass, with a quiet that felt, somehow, like an apology, though she told herself that was the kind of interpretation she should not be indulging. Wolves did not apologize. Kings did not sit vigil outside the borders of their territory for women they had exiled for treason. She was applying a framework that the situation did not support, and she knew it, and she watched the wolf in the gray light anyway, and felt the ache of it moving through her, the way cold moved through stone. Slowly, completely, getting into every crack. On the 6th night, it was not a wolf that came to the border. It was a man. She heard him before she saw him, the sound of boots on the hard ground moving with a deliberateness that did not try to be quiet, the kind of approach that announces itself, because the person making it has decided that concealment is not the point. She was sitting on the low stone wall at the settlement's edge, which had become her habit, the place where she came when sleep was not available, and she needed to make peace with the open air. She did not get up when she heard him. She did not look toward the trees. She waited. Caspian Drave stepped out of the darkness and stopped 6 feet from her, and they looked at each other across that distance in the particular quiet of two people who have a great deal to say and are uncertain where to begin. He looked the way kings looked when they had not slept in a week and had been living inside a complicated problem and had arrived somewhere they did not entirely know how to be. Less like the figure who had read her sentence in the Great Hall, and more like the man whose personal journal she had catalogued in the restricted archives 3 years ago, the private accounts of a ruler who worried constantly about getting things wrong and drove himself without mercy in the service of getting them right. She had not been supposed to read those journals. She had read them anyway. She had understood something about him afterward that she suspected he would have preferred she did not know. You knew it. Was me, he said. It was not quite a question. Every night for 6 nights, she said, and you still would not tell me. No. He was quiet for a moment. The night around them was very still, the particular stillness of borderlands in the small hours when even the wind rests. I found the proof without you, he said. Something moved through her at that. A complicated wave of feeling that she did not try to categorize because it contained too many components. Relief. Something else. Something that she was going to need more time and distance to properly identify. I know, she said. You would. You are very methodical. Something in his expression shifted at that. A fractional change that she might have missed if she had not been paying close attention. You know things about me, he said slowly. I was your archivist for 7 years, she said. It was my job to know things. That is not what I mean. She looked at him steadily. I know, she said. Another silence. Caspian looked at the gray ground between them, then back at her. He had the bearing of a man who was accustomed to delivering difficult truths from a position of authority, and was finding it significantly harder to do so from a position of something closer to supplication. She found that she did not feel the satisfaction she might have expected to feel at seeing him in this position. She felt something considerably more inconvenient than satisfaction. I made a mistake, he said. A serious one. I moved too quickly on evidence that was constructed. I did not verify the testimony with the rigor I should have applied. I allowed political pressure to accelerate a verdict, and the person who paid for that failure was you." He paused. "I am sorry." She had imagined this moment, in the 14 days since the sentencing, the way you imagine things you believe will never happen. The way you use the imagining as a kind of pressure valve for feelings that have nowhere else to go. In the imagined version, she had said precise and devastating things. In the real version, sitting on the stone wall in the gray light with Caspian Drave, standing 6 feet away looking like a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a long time, and had arrived at the place where he was finally allowed to put it down, she said, "I know. That is the second time you have said that," he said. "You apologize correctly," she said. "You do not explain it or qualify it or make it about your intentions. You state the failure, you name who was harmed, and you say the words. Most people do not know how to do that." She paused. "I have spent 7 years reading your official records. Your apologies are always structured the same way. I recognize the pattern." He stared at her. There was something in his expression that she had not seen there before. Something that took her a moment to identify because it was not an emotion she associated with kings in her experience of historical records. He looked faintly. "Undone. You read the official records," he said slowly. "And the personal journals in the restricted archive," she said, because she had held enough things in tonight, and this was one she was willing to let go. "Those were classified." "Yes," she said. "I know. I read them anyway." "And you still chose silence," he said. "Even knowing, you chose to take the exile rather than say the name." She looked at him for a long moment, weighing what to say, the way she weighed everything, with the careful attention of someone who understood that words placed in the wrong order could do lasting damage. "When someone trusts you with knowledge of their worst fears," she said finally, "knowledge they did not intend to share, knowledge they would be devastated to know you possessed, you have a choice. You can use that knowledge for your own benefit, or you can treat it the way you treat any fragile, important thing that has been placed in your care." She paused. "I am an archivist. I know how to handle fragile things." The silence that followed was the longest one yet. Caspian looked at her with an expression that had moved past undone into something she had even fewer frameworks to describe, something raw and careful and wide open. Then he said, very quietly, "Who was it?" And she told him, because he had found it himself anyway, because the time for silence on this particular subject was done, because she was tired, and the truth had weight that she had been carrying alone for 14 days, and setting it down, even here, even into hands that had failed her once, felt like the first real breath she had taken since the sentencing. She said the name, and she watched it land in him, watched him absorb it with the controlled stillness of a man who has been expecting a blow and has prepared himself to receive it without staggering. Lady Venna Castile, the king's chief political advisor, the architect of the Northern Accord negotiations, the woman who had constructed a 15-year career out of being indispensable, who had needed that document to disappear because it contained evidence of a secondary agreement she had made on the king's behalf without his knowledge, an agreement that would have unraveled the official accord and her position along with it, who had chosen Sarah because Sarah was quiet and competent and had access, and had never anticipated that Sarah would simply accept the exile without speaking. "She did not know why you were silent," Caspian said, and it was not quite a question. "No," Sarah said. "She thought I was afraid of her, or that I lacked the evidence to refute the accusation convincingly." She paused. She did not consider the third option. "That you would protect her. That I would protect the accord," Sarah said. "The accord was more important than what she did to me. If I had spoken, the investigation would have consumed the negotiations. The Northern Pack Alliance would have dissolved. 60 years of political groundwork." She shook her head slightly. "I have read the history of what happens when that alliance fails. I was not going to be the reason it failed again. Caspian was very still. "You protected an agreement that benefits my kingdom," he said carefully, "by allowing yourself to be exiled for a crime you did not commit. Yes. At the cost of your position, your home, your pack bond. Yes. For 60 years of political groundwork that most people in this pack do not know exists. I know. It exists," she said. "I catalogued it." He looked at her for a very long time, with an expression that had arrived somewhere beyond words, somewhere in the territory of feeling that language is only an approximation of. Then he sat down on the stone wall beside her, not close enough to be improper, close enough to be deliberate, and he looked out at the gray-silver landscape of the borderlands and was quiet for a while. She let him be quiet. She was good at quiet. She had spent 7 years in archives, which were the natural habitat of quiet people who understood that silence was not absence, but a kind of fullness. "I need to go back," he said finally. "There is a great deal to do. Venna will be arrested by dawn. The accord will need to be examined. The secondary agreement she made will need to be addressed." He paused. "And your name will need to be restored. Publicly and completely, with a full accounting before the entire pack." "I understand," she said. "I do not know yet how long it will take to arrange the ceremony properly," he said. "A few days, perhaps a week. I want it done correctly." He was quiet for a moment. "You will stay here until then?" "I do not have a great deal of other options," she said. "No," he agreed. And there was something in his voice then, something quiet and careful, and very much not the voice of a king conducting official business. Something that moved through her like the first note of a song you had been trying to remember for years and had finally heard again. "I suppose you do not." He stood. He looked at her one more time, with that same open expression that she was going to need significant time and distance to process properly. "Sarah." "Yes," she said. "The journals," he said. "The restricted archive. I would like to know, eventually, what you found in them. What you understood." He paused. "I think you understood things that I have not allowed anyone else close enough to see." She looked up at him in the gray light. "I think," she said carefully, "that is a conversation for after the ceremony." Something moved in his expression that was very close to the beginning of a smile, careful and unpracticed, like an expression that had not been used in a long time and was finding its way back. "Yes," he said. "I think it is." He turned and walked back toward the tree line, and she sat on the stone wall and watched him go, and felt something in the carefully maintained structure of her composure begin to shift in a way. That was not a crack, but an opening, a door, a possibility she had not quite permitted herself to consider until now. If you want to see how this story ends, make sure you are subscribed with notifications on. The formal restoration ceremony was scheduled for 7 days after Caspian's visit to the border, but the preparations that preceded it began almost immediately, and their ripples reached Ashwick long before the official messenger arrived with the summons. Dagna heard the news first, from a trader who came through Ashwick 3 days later with supplies and the particular gleeful urgency of someone carrying significant gossip. Lady Venna Castile had been arrested. The arrest had been conducted at dawn, discreetly, with the minimum of ceremony that the situation required, but the Pack Council had been convened within hours, and by midday the arrest was official record, and by evening the story was moving through the pack with the speed that important stories always achieved in communities built on shared bonds and communal attention. The traitor had the broad outlines more or less correct, and had embellished them in the way that traitors always embellish things, because embellishment was a professional courtesy to the audience. But the core of it was true enough. Lady Venna had used documents she had no right to use, had framed an archivist to cover the evidence, had been found out, had been arrested, and the archivist was to be publicly restored. Dagna came to find Sarah in the kitchen, where Sarah was methodically chopping root vegetables with the particular focused energy that she brought to physical tasks when her mind was doing something complicated in the background. Dagna stood in the doorway and looked at her for a moment before saying anything, with the assessment of someone who had watched this woman for 3 weeks and had arrived at conclusions she had not shared. "You knew," Dagna said. "Yes," Sarah said without looking up from the vegetables. "And you still did not say it?" "No." Dagna was quiet for a moment. "That was either very principled or very foolish," she said. "Probably both," Sarah said. "The messenger came from the palace this morning," Dagna said. "While you were in the East Field. You are summoned for a restoration ceremony in 4 days." She paused. "They sent a royal carriage." Sarah set down the knife. She looked at her hands for a moment. The practical, careful hands of a woman who had spent 7 years handling fragile things and 3 weeks building walls and learning the geography of exile. Then she looked at Dagna. "I did not expect a carriage," she said. "No," Dagna said. "Neither did I." She crossed the room and sat down at the kitchen table with the comfortable authority of a woman who had built this space and had every right to it. And she looked at Sarah with the direct gaze of someone who had nothing left to be diplomatic about. "I have had a lot of exiles come through Ashwick in 11 years. Some of them deserved what they got. Some of them did not. Most of them were somewhere complicated in between. But in 11 years, I have never had one sent back in a royal carriage. And I have never had one who sat on that border wall every night for 3 weeks without asking anything of anyone." She paused. "Who are you protecting?" Sarah considered the question. Outside the kitchen window, the gray-silver light of the borderlands moved across the stone of the settlement courtyard. Familiar. Now, the particular quality of light she had come to associate with a kind of peace that was not happiness, but was something, a stripped-down and honest version of okayness that she thought might be more durable than the more comfortable version she had known before. "The pack," she said, "and someone who was too frightened to protect himself." Dagna looked at her for a long moment. "The king," she said. "The accord," Sarah said. "The 60 years of work that he does not know is at risk. The alliance that keeps the northern border stable and the pack safe. I was protecting that." She paused. "And yes, him. Also him. I am aware of the inconvenience of that." Dagna's expression did something complicated and wry. "The royal carriage makes more sense now," she said. "I imagine it does," Sarah said. She left Ashwick the next morning, in the carriage that was more comfortable than anything she had slept on in 3 weeks, with Dagna standing in the settlement doorway watching her go the same way she had watched her arrive, with arms crossed, and the expression of someone who had seen this particular walk many times, but was revising her assessment of what it meant. The other permanent residents of Ashwick had gathered in the courtyard in various states of early morning dishevelment, and one of the younger ones, a boy of about 16, who had been exiled 6 months ago for reasons that Sarah suspected were considerably more complicated than the official account, pressed a small piece of carved stone into her hand as she passed. It was rough-shaped but recognizable, a wolf's head, and she held it in her palm for a moment, before putting it carefully in her pocket. She would not forget Ashwick. She would write about it when she was back in the archives and had access to paper and the proper tools. She would record the names of the people there and the things they had built from nothing, and the particular dignity that survived in the absence of pack bonds and official recognition. She would write it carefully and accurately, and she would place it in the historical record where it belonged, because things that deserved to be remembered deserved someone paying attention. The drive to the palace took half a day. She spent it looking out the carriage window at the landscape shifting from border gray to pack gold as they moved into Drave territory, watching the familiar countryside of her previous life pass by with the slightly altered perspective of someone returning from a place that had changed her in ways she had not yet fully mapped. The forests she had driven through dozens of times looked the same and different. The way anything looks when you have spent time in a place that showed you what you were made of, and you have discovered that the answer is something you can live with. The palace gates arrived in late afternoon, and the guards there came to attention in a way that suggested they had been specifically briefed on her arrival, and the Yao Kuayu carriage moved through the courtyard and stopped at the main entrance where, to her considerable surprise, Elder Rowe was waiting. He was very old, and he had been elder of the Drave pack for 37 years, and he had the expression of a man who had presided over many ceremonies of many kinds and had learned to hold his face neutral in the face of the unexpected. He did not quite manage neutral when he saw her step out of the carriage. He managed something that was technically neutral in structure, but had warmth underneath it. The warmth of a man who had known her since she was a girl of 19, first entering the archives, and had never entirely believed what he had been asked to record about her. "Sarah," he said. "Elder Rowe," she said. "I am glad you are back," he said. And the simplicity of it broke something small and tight in her chest that had been braced against elaborate apologies and formal proceedings. She took a breath. She held herself together. "Thank you," she said. "I need to check the archive entry," she said. "The one from the sentencing. I need to verify the spelling of my name." Elder Rowe blinked. Then he made a sound that was clearly the beginning of a laugh that he had converted at the last moment to a cough. "It is spelled correctly," he said. "I made sure of it myself." "Good," she said. "That is good." She was given her rooms back, her old rooms that had been left more or less as she had left them, because no one had wanted to displace her. "Things in case," Elder Rowe explained carefully. There was reason to restore her, and everything needed to be in its proper place. She stood in the center of her sitting room with her few Ashwick possessions, and looked at the shelves of books, and the desk she had worked at for 7 years, and the window that looked out over the palace gardens, and felt the specific disorientation of someone returning to a version of themselves. They were no longer quite the same person as. The room was the same. She had changed. The work of the next few days would be determining what fit and what needed to be renegotiated. She did not see Caspian that first day, or the next. She was visited by the head archivist, who expressed profound relief at her return with the particular eloquence of a man who had spent 3 weeks doing her job and discovered that he had significantly underestimated the amount of work it involved. She was visited by the palace physician, who checked her over with professional thoroughness and declared her in reasonable health for someone who had spent 3 weeks doing manual labor in the border territories. She was visited by the intelligence chief, who asked her a series of precise questions about what she knew regarding Lady Venna's actions, which she answered with the same precision she brought to everything, and who thanked her afterward with a formality that contained something more complicated underneath it, something that felt like the beginning of a different kind of respect. She was not visited by the king. She was aware of this in the way she was aware of most things, precisely and without performing feelings about it. He was dealing with the political consequences of Lady Venna's arrest, which were, as she had anticipated, considerable. The Northern Accord was under review. The secondary agreement Venna had made without authorization was being carefully unwound. The council was in emergency session. There was a great deal to manage, and Caspian Drave had always managed the things he had to manage before he managed the things he wanted to manage. She knew this about him. She had read 7 years of records that documented it. On the morning of the 3rd day, she returned to the archives. She walked through the familiar rooms with their smell of old paper and binding glue, and the particular dust that accumulated only in places where knowledge was stored in large quantities. And she felt the spaces of her chest open in a way they had been closed for 3 weeks, the particular relief of a person returning to the environment in which they most fully exist. She went to the restricted archive first, and she found the section where she kept the record of wrongful exiles, the historical documentation she had assembled over years from cases spread across centuries, and she added an entry. She wrote her own name. She wrote the date of the exile and the date of the return. She wrote what had happened, accurately and without embellishment, because accuracy was its own kind of dignity. She spelled everything correctly. She double-checked it twice. She was at her main desk, working through the backlog that had accumulated in her absence, when she became aware of a presence in the archive entrance. She did not look up immediately. She was in the middle of cross-referencing a citation, and the citation deserved to be finished. She finished it. Then she looked up. Caspian Drave was standing in the entrance to the restricted archive, still and quiet, with his hands loose at his sides, in a posture she recognized from her 7 years of observation as a posture that did not belong to a king conducting official business. It was his private posture, the one that appeared in the journals, but not in the official portraits. The one that meant he was present as a person, rather than a ruler. He was looking at her with the expression that she had been carrying in the back of her mind since the night at the border. The one she still did not have adequate words for, but had begun to think of, privately, as the expression he kept for things he had not yet figured out how to protect. "The archive looks well," he said. "It always looks well," she said. "I spent 3 weeks in the borderlands, and it looks well because I built good systems before I left." "Yes," he said. "I read the systems documentation while you were gone. Your deputy kept referring to it." He paused. "You wrote documentation for your own." "Absence." "I always write documentation for my absence," she said. "I go on holiday occasionally. Or I did, before the exile. It is good practice." He came into the archive then, moving with the careful awareness of someone entering a space that has its own rules, and she tracked him with the peripheral attention she kept for things that required monitoring without being stared at. He stopped at the reading table a few feet from her desk, and she looked at him properly, and they were quiet for a moment in the way that two people who have already said several important things to each other can be quiet, the silence feeling populated rather than empty. "The ceremony is tomorrow morning," he said. "The full council will be present. The pack elders, the senior wolves." He paused. "I will read the restoration statement myself. I wanted you to know that." "You do not need to do that," she said. "I know," he said. "I want to." Another pause. "There will also be a formal acknowledgement of what you did. The protection of the Accord during a period when you had every reason to expose it and save yourself. The council is..." He paused, selecting the word with visible care. "Impressed is an inadequate word. Humbled may be closer." "I would prefer if the acknowledgement were kept relatively brief," she said. "I am not comfortable with being made a figure in the record rather than a keeper of it." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "I know," he said. "I have added a note to that effect." He looked at her for a long moment. "You are remarkable, Sarah." She looked up from her work and met his eyes directly, something she had been careful about managing in previous encounters, because direct eye contact with Caspian Drave had always produced a response in her that she had spent 7 years very effectively managing. She was less certain she could manage it now. "You came to the archive to tell me I am remarkable," she said. "I came to the archive," he said, "because I wanted to see you in the place where you make sense. And I wanted to ask you something that I would like to ask before the ceremony makes everything more complicated." She waited. He looked at her with that open, careful expression that she was going to need significant time to process, except that she was beginning to understand that time was not actually what she needed, that the processing had been happening steadily for 3 weeks in the borderlands and 7 years before that, and that what she actually needed was to stop managing and allow herself to simply know what she knew. "The journals," he said. "The things you understood about me that I have not allowed anyone else to see." He paused. "I want to know what they were. Not after the ceremony. Before. I want to know now, if you are willing to tell me." She set down her pen. She looked at him across the few feet of archive space between them, this man who had failed her completely and arrived at her border at midnight in wolf form. To acknowledge it, who had found the truth without her help, and was arranging to restore her name publicly, and was standing in her archive, asking to be known before the ceremony made him the king again. She thought about the journals, about the man in those pages who worried constantly about justice and whether he was administering it correctly, who had written, in the private record that no one was supposed to read, that the worst thing about power was that it insulated you from feedback, that people stopped telling you true things, that you could be wrong for years and never know it because everyone around you had an interest in your certainty. "You are afraid," she said, "of being wrong and never knowing it. It is the thing that drives you more than ambition or duty or any of the things you present publicly. It is why you are methodical, why you examine everything, why you went to the border yourself instead of sending someone." She paused. "You went to the border yourself because..." You needed to know if your read on the situation was accurate, and you did not trust anyone else to tell you if it was not. The silence that followed was the most complete one yet. The silence of something true, landing in a place that was not armored against it. He looked at her with an expression that had gone somewhere past undone, somewhere in the territory of being seen so precisely that the only response is something close to stillness. "Yes," he said, and his voice was very quiet. "That is exactly it." "I know," she said softly. "I have known for 3 years, since I read the journals." She paused. "I have not told anyone. I will not tell anyone." "I know," he said, and then, more quietly, "That is how I know I can trust you." She looked at him. He looked at her. The archive was very quiet around them. The old paper and the bound volumes and the carefully preserved records of everything the Drave pack had ever been or done. All of it holding its breath in the way that spaces hold their breath when something is happening in them that will eventually be worth recording. "I think," Sarah said carefully, "that the conversation about the journals is not finished." "No," he agreed. "I do not think it is. And I think," she said, "that it is the kind of conversation that should not happen in the archive." "Where then?" She thought about it. "Somewhere outside," she said. "Somewhere the light is not gray. After the ceremony, when the political implications have been managed, and the Northern Accord has been reviewed, and the pack has settled, and you have done all the things you need to do first, then we have the rest of the conversation." He looked at her with something that had become, unmistakably, the beginning of a real smile, not the careful fractional version she had seen at the border, but something warmer and less guarded, and considerably more dangerous to her composure. "You are already making me wait," he said. "I am always going to make you wait for the things that matter," she said. "You should know that about me now." "I think," he said, "that I have always known it." He held her gaze for another moment, then stepped back toward the archive entrance. "Tomorrow morning. The ceremony begins at 9th hour. "I will be there," she said. "Yes," he said. "You will." He paused at the entrance. "Sarah, sleep tonight. You have earned it." She watched him leave. Then she picked up her pen and looked at the citation she had been cross-referencing, and set the pen down again, and sat for a moment in the quiet of the archive with her hands still and her breathing steady, and the particular sensation of something in the careful architecture of her interior rearranging itself to accommodate a new possibility, the way a good archive accommodates new material by making space without losing anything that was already there. She picked up the pen again. She finished the cross-reference. She spelled everything correctly. The restoration ceremony was held in the Great Hall at 9th hour, under the same banners, and in the same ceremonial circle, where the exile had been pronounced 24 days earlier. The hall was full, as it had been then, but the quality of the assembly was different, the same bodies in the same seats producing an entirely different frequency of attention, something leaning forward rather than sitting back, something with the quality of a community trying to understand how it had arrived at a mistake, and what the shape of making it right might look like. Elder Rowe opened the proceedings with the formal language that ceremonies required, and then Caspian Drave stepped to the center of the circle, and the hall went to a stillness that was complete. He read the restoration statement himself, as he had promised. It was precise and thorough, the way his apologies always were, naming the failure clearly, naming what it had cost, naming who had been harmed, offering no qualification that softened what had happened, or dispersed the accountability into abstract forces. He said Sarah's name 3 times, each time with a clarity that carried through the hall to every corner. He said the word innocent. He said the words wrongfully exiled. He said the words restored with full honor, and he said it the way that statements that mean something get said, from the place in a person where the thing being said is also true, not just formally true, but actually true in a way that changes how they carry themselves. Sarah stood in the circle and received the restoration the way she had received the exile, with her hands loose at her sides and her chin lifted and her face composed. But it was a different composure now, not the composure of someone absorbing a blow, but the composure of someone receiving something they had not allowed themselves to fully want until the moment it arrived. She felt the pack bond re-establishing itself as the formal language reached its completion, a thread of warmth pulling taut in. The center of her chest, not the same thread that had been severed on the night of the exile, but something new, something that had grown in the gray lands and come back with her, stronger for having been absent and returned. She felt the hall around her, the 300 wolves whose shared consciousness hummed at the frequency of a pack reassembling around a wound it was trying to close, and she allowed herself to feel it instead of categorizing it, allowed herself to be in it instead of beside it, and it was overwhelming and good. After the formal restoration, after Elder Rowe had updated the official record and the ceremonial seal had been pressed to the new document, there was a section of the proceedings that Sarah had not been told about in advance. Caspian stepped forward again, and the hall settled back into that complete stillness, and he spoke for perhaps 3 minutes about what Sarah had done in the borderlands, not the exile itself, but what had preceded it, the choice she had made in the great hall when she could have spoken and had not. He did not use the word sacrifice, which was the word that most people in the hall would have reached for. He used the word responsibility, and he used the word knowledge, and he said that understanding the historical weight of a 60-year alliance and choosing to protect it at personal cost was the action of someone who understood what the pack was for in a way that most people who occupied positions of power did not. Because most people in positions of power had not spent 7 years learning why the pack had survived everything it had survived. He said her name again. He said it simply, without ceremony, the way you say the name of someone who is not a historical figure, but a person standing in front of you. She looked at him across the ceremonial circle. He looked at her. The hall was very quiet. She had spent 7 years recording other people's histories. She had not anticipated that her own would require this much careful management. She filed it away, in the internal archive that she ran with the same precision she brought to the official one, under a heading she had not needed before, but was now fairly certain she would need to return to regularly. After the ceremony, after the formal reception that followed, after the council members and pack elders had made their formal acknowledgments, and the hall had gradually returned to its ordinary frequency, she walked out through the side entrance to the palace gardens, where the late autumn light was doing the specific thing it did at this hour, turning everything it touched into something that belonged to a different and more forgiving season. She sat on the bench near the northern hedge, where she had come to eat her lunch on good weather days for 7 years, and she looked at the light on the stones, and she breathed slowly, and let herself be glad. She heard his footsteps on the garden path a few minutes later. She did not look up immediately. She gave him the time it took to cross the garden and arrive at the bench, and then she looked at him, and he sat down beside her with the deliberateness that she had come to recognize as his particular version of intention, everything considered, nothing accidental. "The council meeting will begin in an hour," he said. "I know," she said. "I have perhaps 40 minutes," he said. She looked at the garden, at the light on the stones, at the late-season flowers that were still low, holding on with the particular stubbornness of things that know winter is coming and have decided to make the most of the time remaining. "Then we should not waste them," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have been thinking about what you said in the archive, about the thing that drives me, about being wrong and never knowing it." He paused. "I have been thinking that the solution to that problem, the thing I have been missing, is someone who reads everything and tells me true things." "You have advisors," she said. "I have advisors," he agreed, "who have interests in my certainty. That is different." He looked at her. "You have no interest in my certainty. You have an interest in accuracy. That is what I need." She considered this. "You are describing a role," she said carefully. "I am describing a beginning," he said. "The role is negotiable. The accuracy is not." She turned to look at him, fully, with the direct gaze that she had been managing carefully for 7 years and had been significantly less careful about in the past 24 days, and she looked at him with the same attention she brought to everything she considered worth understanding, and he looked back at her without looking away, with the open expression that she was going to stop finding so difficult to name and simply call what it was. The face of a man who had decided to be known. "I need time," she said. "I know," he said. "I have been managing things carefully for a very long time," she said. "I am going to need to take this slowly." "I know," he said again, and the patience in his voice was real. The patience of a methodical man who had spent 3 weeks sitting at a border in wolf form and had clearly arrived at conclusions about what he was willing to wait for. "Sarah, I am not asking you to stop being careful. I am asking you to be careful in a direction that includes me." She looked at the light on the stones. She thought about the archive and the journals and the entry she had written for herself in the record of wrongful exiles, and the way a good archive made space for new material without losing what was already there. She thought about the wolf at the border of the gray lands, coming back night after night, not asking anything, simply present in the particular way that presence can be its own kind of communication. She thought about accuracy, and what it meant to record things as they were rather than as you wished they were, or feared they might be. "All right," she said. "In a direction that includes you." She paused. Slowly, he agreed. The garden was very quiet around them, the kind of quiet that had substance, the kind you could hold in your hands. In the distance, somewhere in the formal rooms of the palace, a bell marked the beginning of the hour, and she knew he would have to leave soon for the council meeting, and she knew she would return to the archive and the work that was waiting there, and she knew that all of this was beginning, not ending. The way restoration is not a return to what was, but an arrival at something new that has room for everything that came before. He stood. He looked at her one more time with that open, careful face. "I will find you after the council session," he said. "I will be in the archive," she said. "Yes," he said. "I know where to find you." He turned to walk back toward the palace, then stopped. "Sarah, the entry in the restricted archive, the one you wrote this morning, about the wrongful exile." She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "I read it," he said. "While you were in the ceremony. I went to the archive and I read it." He paused. "You wrote it with extraordinary care." "I always write things with extraordinary care," she said. "Yes," he said quietly. "I know. That is why it means what it does." He walked back toward the palace, and she watched him go, and sat in the garden for a few minutes more, with the late light on the stones, and the particular someone who has been through the thing they were afraid they could not survive, and has discovered that they are still themselves on the other side of it, changed but continuous, broken in some places but open in others, with the specific kind of quiet that lives in a person who has found, against all expectation, that the archive of their own life has room for chapters they had not planned. She stood. She walked back into the palace. She went to the archive, and she sat at her desk, and she picked up her pen, and she got back to work. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who loves epic romance. Tell me in the comments, did you see this ending coming?